Meri Brown called it Worthy Up, but what if the real story is not what she says it means, but why she needed it in the first place? Stay with me, because the answer may change how you see Meri's journey. For years, Sister Wives viewers have heard Meri Brown talk about worthiness, personal growth, and becoming a stronger version of yourself. But one phrase has continued to stand out because it sounds simple while leaving people wondering what it actually means. And that phrase is Worthy Up. Meri has now explain the idea behind the brand, and at first the message sounds empowering because the central idea is that people do not need permission from anyone else to recognize their own value. But once you look closer, there is a much bigger story behind how this phrase became part of Meri's public life and eventually became a business. According to the information presented in the original discussion, Worthy Up was introduced as a community focused on transformation, self-discovery, connection, and personal growth, with the goal of helping people recognize their own value and move forward in life. Meri has also described worthiness as something that already exists within a person rather than something that another person has to give them, and that idea becomes especially interesting when we remember how different Meri's life looks today compared with the years viewers watched her inside the Brown family. For a long time, her story on Sister Wives was closely connected to loneliness, complicated relationships, and the difficult process of understanding where she belonged after years of living in a plural family structure. Then came a major change when Meri and Kody Brown confirmed that their marriage relationship had permanently ended in January 2023, and after that point, viewers began seeing a very different side of Meri. She appeared more focused on travel, business, personal independence, and creating a new identity outside the relationship that had defined so much of her television story. Worthy Up became part of that transformation, and when the official website was launched in 2024, it presented the brand as a place where people could connect, grow, and rediscover their value. The original discussion also points out that the early membership structure included several paid levels, and that the pricing created questions among some viewers because people wanted to understand exactly what they were receiving for their membership fee. That question became even more important when Meri began discussing Worthy Up publicly, because viewers were waiting for a simple explanation of what the community actually offered and why someone would want to join. The interesting part is that Meri's explanation focuses heavily on the emotional meaning of worthiness rather than a simple list of services, and that leaves the audience with a question that becomes more important as the story continues. If Worthy Up is built around the belief that every person is already worthy, then what is the journey of becoming more worthy actually? Message appears to be centered around the idea that personal value does not depend on another person's approval. Involved. This is where the story becomes much more complicated, because Meri's message is not necessarily about changing who someone is, but about changing how they see themselves, and that distinction is important. Her message appears to be centered around the idea that personal value does not depend on another person's approval, and that people can choose to recognize their own value regardless of what happened in their past. For someone who spent years being watched on television while dealing with difficult family relationships, that message naturally connects with her own public transformation. Viewers watched Meri experience painful seasons and complicated conversations, and now they are watching her build something that reflects the life she wants to live after those experiences. The question is not simply whether Worthy Up is a business or whether it is a personal philosophy, because based on the source material, it appears to be both, and that combination is exactly what makes the subject so interesting. Instead of presenting Worthy Up as a traditional course with a simple beginning, middle, and end, the concept is presented more like an ongoing journey where members can continue learning, connecting, reflecting, and developing themselves. That means the experience can be highly personal, because one person may see the community as encouragement, while another person may see it as a place to connect with people who understand similar experiences. And this is where we need to separate what Meri has actually said from the opinions and reactions surrounding the brand. Some viewers have questioned the pricing and the level of detail in the public explanation, while others may connect strongly with the message itself. Neither reaction changes the central point that Meri has built a new chapter around the idea of recognizing personal worth, and that chapter is very different from the version of Meri audiences first met years ago. But there is another layer that makes this story worth watching, because Meri's transformation did not happen in isolation. Her public identity has been changing alongside the end of her relationship with Kody and her growing independence. And when someone moves from a long period of uncertainty into a period where they are building their own identity, the language they use to describe that transformation can become extremely important. That may be why the phrase "worthy up" has become so closely connected to Meri, because it represents more than a business name in her public story. It represents the message she wants people to associate with the next chapter of her life. And that brings us to the part of the story that many viewers may have overlooked, because the real question is not simply what "worthy up" means on paper, but why this particular message became so important to Meri after everything she experienced. And if you look at the timing, the answer becomes much easier to understand, because after the end of her relationship with Cody, she was no longer defining herself through the role viewers had known for years, and instead she began presenting herself as someone building a life around independence, personal growth, travel, business, and self-respect. That shift is what makes "worthy up" more than a simple phrase, and it is also why we need to look at the bigger picture before deciding what the brand means. And whether Meri's explanation gives viewers the complete answer, the story is still unfolding, and the next part may be even more interesting, because once a reality television personality turns a personal message into a public community, the audience naturally begins asking what happens behind the message and what the future of that community could look like. And that is exactly where Meri's "worthy up" journey takes us next. Because the deeper we look, the more obvious it becomes that the phrase was never just about a few words on social media. It was connected to a much larger transformation in Meri's life, and the next question is what that transformation really means for the woman viewers have watched for so many years. Now that we understand why "worthy up" became such an important part of Meri's new chapter, we can look at the larger conversation surrounding it, because the most interesting part is not simply the name or the message, but the way the idea connects to the themes that have followed Meri's story for years. The original discussion describes "worthy up" as a community built around transformation, self-discovery, connection, and inspiration, and those ideas are broad enough that different people can interpret them in different ways. That can be a strength, because personal growth does not look identical for everyone, and a community focused on self-worth can allow members to bring their own experiences into the conversation. At the same time, it explains why some viewers have wanted more specific information about what the community provides, because when a message is based on an emotional experience, people naturally want to know how that experience becomes something practical. The answer, according to the material, is that "worthy up" is not being presented as a simple formula where a person follows several steps and reaches a final destination. Instead, the journey is ongoing, and the focus is on continuing to recognize personal value, develop confidence, connect with others, and create positive change in everyday life. That approach also fits with the larger story Meri has been telling since her separation from Cody, because she has repeatedly presented herself as someone moving forward rather than someone remaining defined by what happened in the past. And this is where the subject becomes more than a discussion about a business, because it becomes a discussion about identity. Meri spent years on television being discussed through the lens of her marriage, her place in the Brown family, and the challenges that came with plural marriage. But after the relationship ended, she had the opportunity to decide how she wanted to introduce herself to the world, and "worthy up" became one part of that new identity. Her message is essentially that your past does not have to determine your future, and that your value does not disappear simply because another person fails to recognize it. That is a powerful idea, and it helps explain why the phrase has remained connected to her personal brand. But there is also a lesson here about how reality television personalities evolve after leaving long-running shows or difficult relationships, because the audience often remembers the person they first met and then compares that version with the person they become years later. Meri's story is a perfect example of that process. The woman viewers once saw struggling to understand her place in a complicated family now presents herself up became one part of that new identity. Her message is essentially that your past does not have to determine your future, and that your value does not disappear simply because another person fails to recognize it. That is a powerful idea, and it helps explain why the phrase has remained connected to her personal brand. But there is also a lesson here about how reality television personalities evolve after leaving long-running shows or difficult relationships, because the audience often remembers the person they first met and then compares that version with the person they become years later. Meri's story is a perfect example of that process. The woman viewers once saw struggling to understand her place in a complicated family now presents herself as someone who wants to encourage others to focus on their own value and build a life that feels authentic to them. Whether every viewer agrees with her approach is a separate question, but the change itself is difficult to ignore. And there is another Reason this topic matters because Meri's public journey shows how personal experiences can eventually become part of a larger message. When someone spends years experiencing difficult moments in front of millions of viewers, they can eventually use those experiences as the foundation for something new, and that appears to be what Meri is attempting with Worthy Up. The original discussion also compares this kind of language with the wider world of personal development, where words such as authenticity, vulnerability, growth, and self-worth are commonly used, and that comparison raises an important question about how people understand personal growth today. The key is not to assume that every person who uses these words has the same intention, because the meaning depends on the individual and the community they create. What we can say is that Meri's message has clearly moved toward empowerment and independence, and that direction makes sense when viewed alongside the changes in her personal life since her relationship with Cody ended. She has continued building her own public identity, and Worthy Up gives that identity a central theme. Instead of asking whether she belongs somewhere else, she is asking what she wants to build for herself, and that is a significant change from the questions that once dominated her sister wives' storyline. The most important thing for viewers to understand is that the phrase Worthy Up is not a replacement for Meri's entire story. It is one part of a much larger chapter. And that chapter includes the end of her marriage, her business interests, her travel, her friendships, her personal growth, and her decision to move forward on her own terms. And perhaps that is why the phrase has created so much discussion, because everyone brings a different interpretation to it. Some people may hear a simple message about confidence, while others may see a business concept, and others may simply see a woman who has finally found language for the direction she wants her life to take. But whatever interpretation a viewer chooses, the underlying story remains the same. Meri is no longer waiting for someone else to define her worth, and she is using her public platform to communicate that message to people who may be going through their own difficult transitions. And that brings us back to the question we started with: what exactly does Worthy Up mean? The most accurate answer, based on the source material, is that it means recognizing your value, continuing to grow, and refusing to let another person decide what you deserve. It is less about reaching a final destination and more about continuing the process of becoming comfortable with who you are and where you are going. And maybe that is why the phrase has lasted, because people can attach their own experiences to it. A person recovering from a difficult relationship can interpret it one way, someone starting a new career can interpret it another way, someone simply trying to rebuild confidence can find a completely different. Meri's Worthy Up story is still unfolding, so what do you think about it? Comment below and subscribe now, because you do not want to miss what comes next.